Hello, everybody, and welcome to this event on the coup in Niger and U.S. policy in the Sahel at the Quincy Institute. My name is Alex Thurston. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute, and I teach in the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Cincinnati. We're here today to consider the recent coup in Niger and to discuss some of the national and regional and geopolitical implications of the coup. Just to give some quick background on the Quincy Institute, we're an action-oriented foreign policy think tank based in Washington that advocates a grand policy, a grand strategy of restraint. We aim to move US foreign policy away from endless war and toward vigorous diplomacy, economic engagement, and a focus on existential threats such as climate change. Our vision is a world where peace is the norm and where war is the exception. To give a brief bit of background on the coup in Niger and the circumstances that sparked this webinar, on July 26th, a military coup deposed the elected president of Niger, Mohamed Bazoum. The coup seems to have originated in a power struggle between Bazoum and the head of the presidential guard, General Abdourahmane Tchiani. But the coup has all sorts of, again, regional and geopolitical implications. The Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS, has considered intervening militarily in Niger to reverse the coup. The coup has been condemned by Washington, Paris, Moscow, etc. The coup adds to a series of coups in West Africa, including in Mali, in Guinea, in Burkina Faso, and further afield, such as in Chad and Sudan. So there's a lot at stake in the coup in terms of democratic norms, in terms of the prospects for stability and security in the region. The coup comes amidst a multi-year jihadist insurgency that has affected Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger in particular. There are questions about whether the coup creates an opening for Russia and/or for the Wagner Group to increase their influence in Niger and in the Sahel and in Africa more broadly. There's also implications for the United States, which has been a major actor in Niger for at least the past decade. Washington has spent at least $500 million training and arming Nigerian armed forces. Niger has been treated as a critical counterterrorism partner by the United States and by France. And prior to the coup, the United States had something like 1,100 troops stationed in the region in Niger. So there's a lot, again, to consider. I should also add that many people in Niger have been suffering tremendously both before and after the coup. Niger, even in sort of normal circumstances, is one of the poorest countries in the world, heavily food insecure, and the coup comes again in a context where there's been displacement of at least 700,000 people, where there has been endemic insecurity in different parts of the country. So this is, again, something that has massive implications for ordinary people. We're lucky to be joined here by three experts who I think have specialties and backgrounds that will really complement one another and let us have a really rich discussion. Ms. Hannah Armstrong is a veteran analyst at the Sahel in North Africa who has worked with numerous institutions and think tanks, among them the International Crisis Group, where she was senior Sahel analyst from 2018 to 2021. Some of Hannah's recent work includes a really brilliant paper for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, which looks at trends in security and actually a fall in levels of violence in Western Niger. And this is a paper that I've been recommending widely as critical background for thinking about the coup and its implications. Professor Adekeye Adebajo is a professor and senior research fellow at the University of Pretoria's Center for the Advancement of Scholarship. He holds a PhD from the University of Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He is the author of numerous books, many of which have to do with topics related to peace building, peacekeeping, conflict management, civil war, et cetera, other topics that are crucial for thinking about with regard to Niger. He also has considerable experience working with bodies such as the United Nations and International Peace Institute. And aside from his many scholarly publications, he's also a public intellectual, contributing regularly to newspapers such as Business Day in Nigeria. Finally, our third panelist is Dr. Stephanie Savell, who's the co-director and senior researcher at the Cost of War Project based at Brown University. She's trained as an anthropologist and obtained her PhD from Brown. At the Cost of War Project, her papers include one which came out in 2021 called The Cost of the United States Post-9/11 Security Assistance, How Counterterrorism Intensified Conflict in Burkina Faso and Around the World. So again, directly relevant to the topics that we'll be talking about today with regard to the Sahel. And Dr. Savell is a frequent contributor to the media on topics related to, among others, the US role in counterterrorism and military training programs in Africa and elsewhere. In terms of the format for today, I'm going to ask two rounds of questions to each of the panelists, and then I'll throw out a couple questions for all of the panelists to respond to. And then we'll take questions from the participants, from the attendees, from all of you. As we talk, if questions occur to you, please put them in the Q&A, and then we can answer them basically in the second half of the webinar. And I see that some folks have already started to post their questions, which is excellent. So thanks for doing that. Okay, so I thought we would start with Hannah, actually. So the coup makers in Niger have said that they are reacting to insecurity and bad governance. How do you assess that claim? And could you tell us about Niger's trajectory in recent years and what has led to this coup?
Sure, thanks, Alex. And hi, everybody. So, I mean, it's sort of ironic that the coup leaders are citing insecurity because if you sort of look at the areas in Niger which are dealing with insecurity, which is on the rise across the Sahel region, Niger is battling insurgencies on at least 3 of its borders, and is really the only country in the region to have begun to make some sort of positive progress over the past 18 months. Which really sort of coincides with President Bazoum's time in power. It's kind of a controversial way of achieving this progress. So if you look at the region of North Tillabéri, which runs along the border with Mali, there was a really steep drop in violence from 2021 to 2022. And some of the contributing factors for that drop in violence were policies that really came directly from President Bazoum that were orienting the military to embrace, or orienting the various sort of security structures of the country to explore other options for dealing with the extremist insurgents operating on its borders. And so this led to initiatives to hold dialogue, and these were starting to sort of bear some fruit. So it's a bit ironic that of the 3 countries, Niger was actually starting to sort of make some progress on insecurity. It was also doing a really good job of sort of protecting its borders. So where extremist insurgencies were sort of raging on borders with Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and Mali, they remained relatively contained to the borders. And this was, in part because of Bazoum and his predecessors' policies on sort of how to deal with these types of violence, which in other countries, the response to these types of violence had actually made the violence a lot worse. Having said that, in a broader context, there has been a very steep rise in insecurity in the country of Niger. There's also been a huge influx of foreign funding to fight this insecurity. And so for many Nigerians, what they see is not these sort of incremental, significant shifts in violence on the border, but rather the fact that there's hundreds of millions of dollars flowing into the country, and a rise overall in violence and the number of sort of bad guys, trying to who are actively putting their lives at risk, the lives of their community. Yeah, so this was just to give some kind of context on security. I think I've gotten off track from your question, Alex, and I don't want to ramble on too much.
No, this is great. This is great, and that's a really crucial point about kind of the optics of the foreign assistance, and I think definitely a point that we should come back to. Professor Adebajo, the Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS, has struggled to contain or respond to the recent coups in Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Niger, as I was mentioning in the introduction. With the coup in Niger, ECOWAS has threatened to intervene militarily, as it has previously in the Gambia and elsewhere. How would you characterize ECOWAS's record diplomatically and militarily in terms of responding to coups and conflicts in the region?
Well, I think ECOWAS's record generally was quite good. In the 1990s, for example, ECOWAS pioneered peace enforcement in Liberia and Sierra Leone, and was in both countries for a decade, resulting in 1,500 fatalities and spending at least $2 billion. And it was able to stabilize both countries and then hand over to the UN to kind of complete the process. In the 2000s also, under the ECOWAS executive secretary at the time, Ghanaian Mohamed Chambers, I think ECOWAS did quite well in terms of governance. Its governance protocol obviously had been put in place in 2001. And I think they did very well in places like Togo and Guinea and Burkina Faso and other places to try to manage governance issues there. Less in the last decade or 5 to 10 years, I would say ECOWAS has struggled a bit, and you now have a quarter of the community basically under military rule. And I think what ECOWAS tried to do with the recent coups in places like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea was to put pressure on them to return to civilian rule and to negotiate, 2-year transitions or 3-year transitions, which weren't always convincing, but at least there was some kind of process in place. And all those military regimes were suspended from ECOWAS and remain suspended, but at least there was some negotiation. What happened in this particular case in Niger moved away from that, in that they threatened military action within a week if the junta did not reinstate the constitutionally elected president. And I think that was a bit of a mistake, because unlike 3 decades ago, when Nigeria, for example, was under military rule and could take those sort of interventions, because, unlike Tinubu, the generals, Abacha and Babangida, did not have a parliament or public opinion to consider. I think ECOWAS and Nigeria are in a much weaker position now. Nigeria's military is barely coping with militants of Boko Haram and ISWAP, as you know, Alex, from your work, let alone deploying troops outside. So I think ECOWAS is in a rather difficult situation and boxed itself into a corner by threatening military force. And I think it's now trying to move away from that, with Tinubu facing lots of pressure from traditional and religious groups. And there are obviously lots of trading and family relationships between Nigeria and Niger. And also a fear has been expressed in parts of Nigeria that northern military officers in Nigeria might even threaten Tinubu himself with a coup, based on the kinds of actions that they take. So I can go into the other countries' policies and where other countries stand, but for now, I think that's how I would state the history of it.
Great, thanks. And there's a lot of threads there I'd like to pick up when we come back to you. And I hadn't thought of it that way. A quarter of the region, a quarter of the ECOWAS members being under military rule. Yeah, that's a very stark kind of figure and visual. Stephanie, Niger was a major recipient of, or possibly still is, a major recipient of American, French, and other European security assistance. How do you assess the US-Niger relationship and Niger's place in the so-called global war on terror?
Hi, Alex. Yeah, thank you for having me here. Yes, so the US began assisting Niger with counterterrorism assistance starting in 2002. This was part of what George W. Bush at the time called the global war on terror. And the idea was that the US was going to wage preemptive war. So really getting to root out the source of potential terrorist attacks before they could emerge. And that was the justification for beginning operations in the Sahel region, which at the time had a very low incidence of violent militant attacks. You mentioned 500 million. That's the figure that's kind of circulating in the media. That's only since 2012 that the U.S. has spent 500 million training and arming Nigerian armed forces. So it's much more than that since the beginning of the war on terror in 2001. The U.S. spent over 100 million alone to construct the air base in Agadez, which I visited in January. It's in the north of the country. And the US spends about $20 to $30 million annually to maintain that drone base. The US also has service members and equipment, trainers going in and out at least 2 to 3 other Nigerian military bases in different parts of the country, and worked really closely with the special forces. So we've seen some news reports about General Abdourahmane, who was the leader, the head of the Nigerian special forces. He's someone who worked really closely with the US over the years, and kind of worked hand in hand with this U.S. strategy of special forces operating through 127 ECHO programs, which are, technically train and assist programs by the U.S. government for other countries' military forces. That's the kind of language that's used in practice. It's it looks a lot more like, the U.S. kind of accompanying and oftentimes directing very closely the, raids on militant compounds and things like that. So that's what we saw happening in 2017 when 4 U.S. service members were killed in Niger. Over the past 5 years, I was looking this up recently, U.S. government and companies have earned over $150 million in arms sales to Niger. So arms sales are a big part of the picture. Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken had visited Niger in March. He was positioning, the U.S. was positioning Niger as this important, stable, Blinken called it a model of democracy and a model of resilience. I think there was a really active overlooking of some of the more authoritarian trends in Niger and the kind of instability and deep tensions and rivalries that marked local politics, because the U.S. wanted so much to kind of put its eggs in this basket and have Niger be the bulwark against the so-called terrorist threat. But notably, the U.S. government was not alone. As you said, the French were very involved. They had been, kind of kicked out of Mali. They were using Niger as the same stable partner. Germany, Italy, Belgium, there are many Western powers who are involved and non-Western powers as well. So it's a place where a lot of countries, I think, liked to talk about Niger as a success story for their own military aid. And of course, positioning it, framing it as a story about them rather than seeing it as a story about, Niger using different kinds of allies support for their own purposes and being very strategic about that, which I think is just so often overlooked in all of this talk about, that we're seeing in US media about kind of a new Cold War situation, right? Where, there's a very active overlooking of the fact that the Nigerian government had its own goals and its own rivalries and its own tensions, and it was very strategic in pulling on different allies and assistance where it wanted to.
Great. Yeah, this ties in actually to the next question that I was going to ask for Hannah. But before that, I wanted to highlight some points you made. I hadn't. You always hear the figure about the cost of the drone base in Agadez, but I hadn't thought about the maintenance costs, and that's really important that you highlighted that. And then there's some other, the training issues one I want to come back to. First though, so to Hannah, so you've written extensively about outside actors in the Sahel, and as Stephanie was just saying, there's been a lot of talk in the media about this idea of a new Cold War and about Russian influence in the Sahel. There's been the idea that the coup in Niger is an opening for Russia. How would you assess Russia's role there? And then actually, let's just stick on that for now, and then I might have one follow-up. Yeah, what would you say about Russia's potential prospects for influence there in Niger?
So it's interesting. What we've seen over the past couple of years is that Russia is starting to take the Sahel as a very seriously in terms of geopolitics. So the sort of, because of the sequence of events that has unfolded in Mali and Burkina Faso, which in both cases consisted of sort of one coup d'etat followed by another coup d'etat. In Mali, a pretty quick turn away from France towards Russia as its main security partner. And in Burkina Faso, a little bit more ambiguity, where the leader, has recently gone to this summit, the Russia-Africa summit, but hasn't cut ties to the same extent that Mali has. So there's sort of a playbook at this point for the recent spate of Sahel coup d'etat, and everybody's eyes kind of immediately ricochet over to Russia as this happens. It's also kind of ironic that, or a coincidence that it happened, during the precise moment of the Russia-Africa summit, with Niger being one of the only countries that didn't send a senior leader to attend. Having said that, I mean, there's really no evidence to suggest that Russia played any role in the coup itself, and there's a bit of evidence to suggest that Russia really doesn't find this to be particularly convenient, at least in terms of the Russian state. I think that it highlights the divergence and sometimes, to some extent, perhaps the tensions between how Russia operates and how Wagner operates on the continent. So the statements that the Russian foreign ministry, the Russian foreign ministry has been consistently, calling for a return to constitutional order, whereas the leader of Wagner, Prigozhin, came out with a sort of excited declaration about decolonization. So I think we will see, there's some focus on the Russian flags in the crowds of protesters who have come out in support of the coup. It's certainly true that populations in the Sahel are increasingly seeing Russia as a sort of alternative to the Western mode of support, which has been really sort of catastrophic and has coincided with a lot of increasing insecurity. So I think, to some extent, there is some disinformation and some, sort of flag distribution campaigns happening, no doubt. There's also certainly an element of sort of let's try something else, because what we've been doing, isn't really working. But ultimately, to the question of does this coup serve Russia's interest on the continent, and is this something that's guaranteed to sort of strengthen their position? I think the answer is not necessarily yes. And so it's sort of a distraction to kind of look at these dynamics through the lens of the great power rivalry, because interestingly, Russia and the United States, I think, both have a sort of a similar position on what's happening in Niger right now. And ultimately, and this kind of goes a little bit outside of your question, but it sort of comes back to Algeria and Algeria's role in the region and efforts to sort of stabilize the region, which it may mean we may see Algeria playing more of a kind of a bridging role between these two actors.
No, really well said. And actually, that was gonna be my follow-up question, was whether there were other actors who you wanted to highlight, because I think there's so much talk in the media about US, France, Russia, and I think underscoring the Algerian role really makes sense. Stephanie, were you going to come in?
Yeah, thanks. I also just wanted to underscore Hannah's point in that, the Wagner Group has started in Mali in 2021, and the US has been, funding the Nigerian armed forces and training and equipping since 2002, hundreds of millions, versus the Wagner Group, which is kind of a mercenary group. And, locally, people talk about it as, a mechanism for these regimes, especially in Mali, to secure their own grasp on power, right? So they talk about it as the elite power holders using them as mercenaries in that way. So I think it's really overblown to talk about them as a kind of a equivalent to, the US might pull out and then, they're going to go towards Russia. It's just not at all the same thing. The relationship is not as deep. Wagner is very clearly kind of stoking these kind of anti-colonial sentiments, in part because it has a very clear economic interest in the region. Right? A lot of times it's exchanging, bids on, natural resources in order to provide these kinds of services to the Malian government and a couple others. And I really see this tendency to portray this as a, US West versus Russia in the media as something that lends itself to kind of more of the same, at least where the US is concerned, in terms of a militarized approach to its relationship with Africa. And I think what this moment really calls us to do, in the United States, is to see this as a wake-up call that a dramatically different kind of an approach is needed. And this, the falling back into these tropes of a new Cold War is just really, I think, counterproductive to the paths forward.
Yeah, and I think maybe really overstates Russia's capabilities and Wagner's capabilities in Africa. Yeah. Adekeye, my second question for you was going to be about sort of the domestic Nigerian politics around the intervention, but I think you already basically covered a lot of this in your first answer. I think instead I'll ask you about...
Can I come in on this issue, the external actors? Yeah, because there are 2 points I think are very important. You're talking about Wagner having economic interest in the area, but France has been basically established a relationship with a country like Niger where it could basically guarantee its own companies 96% of the uranium. The first thing it did when it intervened in 2013 in Mali, by the way, was to send troops to Niger to guard uranium mines. And France has ripped off economically many of these countries for the last 5 decades. So I'm kind of a little bit uncomfortable when we talk about Wagner's commercial interests, which are undoubtedly there, but we don't focus enough attention on France. And the one thing we should not underestimate in this crisis, the anti-French sentiment that you see is genuine and deep. France has for 5 decades intervened militarily in these countries, toppled democratic regimes, replaced them with their own kind of more subservient leaders. And economically, it's also, of course, as we know, tied their currencies to the franc and then the euro. It's had a very sordid relationship of France-Afrique. And a lot of this resentment is genuine. And I think if we miss that, we're missing a big part of this. So I think it's important not just to portray Wagner in negative terms, but also to remember that throughout the African continent, the French role has been seen incredibly negatively, and many people on this continent want France to leave Africa.
I think that's really well said, and I think there's been a mistake in a lot of media coverage of dismissing the anti-French sentiment as just being sort of a creation of Russian propaganda or something, and a dismissal of the idea that people would actually have serious reasons, as you just outlined, to feel that France was a negative influence over their former colonies. We're at the halfway mark, so I want to give a chance to the audience. So there were, and this is actually a good segue, because there were a couple of questions in the chat, in the Q&A about uranium. Would anybody like to speak to that, Hannah or others, or Adekeye? Any thoughts on the role of uranium and other thoughts on the Nigerian-French economic relationship and whether that plays a role in the coup or in the general situation? Hannah, do you want to take that, and then we'll open it up to others?
Sure. And maybe just, I just to kind of round out a little bit of the domestic context for the coup, picking up on Adekeye's last points on sort of not overlooking anti-French sentiment. I mean, I wanted to just kind of point out sort of two incidents that I think were really help sort of understand why popular sentiment seems to have sort of been in favor of the putsch. Instead of sort of in support of Bazoum, which seems contradictory to the fact that he's just been elected in a what's regarded as a democratic election. And those two incidents were, there was a killing done by a French military convoy crossing over from Burkina Faso into Niger, in which three civilians were killed, apparently, according to eyewitnesses, by French troops. Who were coming into the country. This was a protest against, French security interventions in the region. And then there was another episode also along the border with Burkina Faso at a gold mine in Tamu, where the Nigerian security forces fired upon a mine that they had sort of warned, not to operate any longer, but was still being operated by, 4 miners. It was thought to be serving, jihadist groups in the area. And so the Nigerians went in and sort of bombed the mine, killing. It's not yet clear how many civilians. But if we look at the sort of civil society response to these killings and the way that it was repressed, it starts to sort of shed some light and context on this kind of groundswell of popular opinion. Which really sort of mixes an anti-French sentiment with a sense that Bazoum was really sort of a tool of the French, or was too closely allied with the French, and perhaps more accountable to them than to his own people. So having kind of said that, to sort of make the domestic response to the coup look a little bit more reasonable, which I think it does have its reasons, its rationalities. In terms of the uranium, I mean, my understanding is, and I've been to the uranium mines in Arlit, and I've been kind of tracking this issue for a while. And my understanding is that it gets a little bit overplayed, the extent to which France is, dependent upon these particular mines for their power supply. At the same time, there's no question that French officials like to sort of downplay it. At the same time, it's unquestionably a very strategic resource, and there's a sense in which if you look at the mines themselves, the production has been declining, and they've been sort of slowly shutting them down and holding on to the Imuraran territory without actually developing anything there. And I think part of that is waiting for uranium prices to go back up, and part of that is not wanting those assets to sort of get into the hands of other actors. But at any rate, it certainly hasn't served Niger, which could be making a lot more money off of this very strategic resource. And France has been for decades artificially and often illegally manipulating prices and dealing with domestic actors in ways that have contributed to this country remaining one of the world's poorest.
Going to the chat, question from Dr. Adel Rubaid, who asks, after the African Union has refused to support the military intervention, what is left for ECOWAS to do in order to restore Bazoum? Maybe we could start with Adekeye on that and then go to others. What can ECOWAS do actually going forward?
Thanks, Alex. I mean, I think it's important to see the balance of forces in ECOWAS, because there are different groups, it seems to me, within ECOWAS. First is Nigeria, which I see as a kind of diminished regional hegemon. It had more capacity in the past. At the moment, it doesn't have the capacity. It has a new, inexperienced president who is more of a domestic politician than a foreign policy expert, and is still trying to establish himself with massive problems domestically, $100 billion debt, removal of the fuel subsidy, which has triggered a cost of living crisis. And I think Tinubu, and internally, a military that is ill-equipped and underfunded and has not been able to provide security, the most basic security, to its own people. So we have to see that as one group. Another group, I think, of hardliners who are pushing for intervention within ECOWAS are Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire, and then Ghana and Guinea-Bissau. Obviously, Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire, the President Ouattara has always been a very influential player within ECOWAS, but he has just got himself an unconstitutional third term. Macky Sall is demonstrating a lot of very bad governance in clamping down on the opposition, dissolving the opposition party, jailing the main opposition leader. And a lot of these leaders are themselves very scared and concerned that their own militaries could draw an example from these copycat type coups. And then you have a third group of maybe more ambivalent states like Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Togo, which maybe don't have the capacity for deploying military troops. And the Liberian president, George Weah, was actually quite critical of his fellow heads of states, complaining about civilian coup d'etat, in which leaders basically manipulate their constitutions to get a third term. And then the fourth group in ECOWAS, of course, are the putschists. So you have Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and now the military junta in Niger, and they're moving in quite a united way. They have lots of experience of cooperation, especially Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. They know each other extremely well. And I think they would be prepared to kind of line up in unity, whether they have the capacity with places like Burkina Faso and Mali having at least half of their territory been overrun by jihadists, whether they actually have the capacity to respond to an ECOWAS troop is another issue. And then finally, Alex, I think one shouldn't also underestimate the fact that the region does not have the logistics or finance to be able to undertake this intervention. The AU mission is pulling out of Somalia, and we've seen the way that it was funded largely by the European Union, and we've seen the way that many regional-led peacekeeping missions have struggled with both finance and logistics. So I think it would be very difficult for ECOWAS to be able to deploy without some kind of support. And if they deployed with the support of France and the US, it would basically be seen as a Western Trojan horse intervention.
I think this is really well said, and thanks for walking us through the different dynamics. And I mean, one that I want to highlight is the issue of civilian authoritarianism and the third term bids and so forth. I think this has really undercut the credibility of particular leaders within ECOWAS, and then also maybe the organization as a whole. And I think it's really important to note that, Macky Sall in Senegal has said now that he won't run for a third term, but then as you pointed out, there's still all these signals of authoritarianism coming from him. So even if it's not the third term issue, it can be the jailing of opposition figures and so forth. The question then for all three panelists, I mean, does this leave us just with the junta in power in Niger? Is that sort of the upshot of all this? Is that the National Council for the Safeguarding of the Fatherland, or however one wants to translate it, is it here to stay for 1, 2, 3, 4 years? Hannah, go ahead.
I could take a shot. I mean, yeah, I think that an intervention to remove them is I think a pretty terrible idea, and fortunately it seems to be falling out of favor and to be increasingly unlikely. In Niger, compared to Mali and Burkina, there is at least the precedent of the last coup d'etat having been followed by a relatively efficient transition and genuine transition to democratic rule. So that's something that sets Niger apart, and that suggests that, unlike Mali and Burkina, where we can really see the juntas entrenching themselves and digging in for a nice long time in power, there is actually some hope that these leaders may be induced to move in a different direction. Given the trends in the region, that may not be the case, but at least there's a precedent. But in terms of, is it still possible? I mean, you'll sort of see people from Bazoum's cabinet, and especially within the French press and sort of French figures who are still sort of talking about restoring Bazoum. And I think that's I think that we've moved beyond that, and the country has sort of moved beyond that.
Question from the chat for Stephanie, or I'll direct this to Stephanie. This is from Ross Silvestri, who says, how can the US avoid getting tunnel vision on terrorism and countering Russian and Chinese influence when looking at Niger and other countries in the Sahel? What is a more holistic approach?
Yeah, thanks. I think the bottom line is the US approach so far to countering so-called terrorism in the region, it just hasn't worked. And there's a really broad, this kind of overly militarized response, this narrative that places a primacy on these governments fighting their own wars on terror. I think the US government has begun to recognize that that's been a mistake. You can see that explicitly stated in the policy in regards to the coastal West African states of Benin and Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, right? This is a new kind of target region for the US in terms of preventing these militant groups from infiltrating through these countries down to the coast, to the ocean, for their economic reasons and smuggling routes and all that. So we, I think in the United States, it's time to ask the big picture questions that don't get asked. Instead of just tweaking U.S. security assistance to make it kind of slightly different, slightly better, let's be courageous enough to say, what we've done so far hasn't worked. A militarized assistance hasn't, and not only pay lip service to a more holistic, development-oriented approach, but completely realize that difference in practice, because I think a lot of times there's a difference between what's said at the level of the US government and what actually happens on the ground, and really what negotiations happen at the level of, for example, the United States Embassy is the ambassador who's the one who decides on the balance of powers between the 3 Ds, defense, diplomacy, and development. And in practice, I think a lot of times the defense approach kind of gains the upper hand. But what would happen if we were to kind of dramatically rethink this and change the narrative and say, actually, the so-called answer to violent militant attacks is not a war. It's never been a war. It's never been effective, not in Afghanistan or anywhere else. So let's look at alternatives. Let's support local efforts at negotiations. We saw the first coup, the first junta-led government in Burkina Faso making some important strides in negotiations with some of the militant groups that were reducing the violence. Let's recognize that the roots of the conflict are structural in nature. This is about people's, this kind of roiling anti-colonial sentiment, right? This kind of the anger at injustice, that the anger at the fact that people are living in extreme poverty, that there's kind of elite corruption. There's so many claims that people have around, we deserve a better life. This colonialism was, utterly unjust. It left us in this place. There's university students I spoke with in Niger who were talking about how the militant groups and they were on the same continuum of kind of frustration with the system as it is, and trying to find, in the case of the militant groups, they're using violence as a tactic. The university students at the time, anyway, that I spoke to them, were using peaceful protest on the streets of the capital, right? So they saw it as one and the same. And so I think there's a real need to address the kind of roots of those grievances that are leading to recruitment to these militant groups and the fact that they're gaining sway.
Really well said. Adekeye, go ahead.
Yeah, I like that. It's really captures it very well in terms of tackling the root causes and adopting a different approach. But for your US audience, I just wanted to add my perspective to US policy. I think we mustn't forget that Barack Obama militarized and continued the securitization of US Africa policy that Bush had begun, as we heard quite succinctly. And we must not forget that it was the actions during the NATO intervention in 2011, which Obama later described as his largest regret. The heavy weapons that those militants took into Mali and the rest of the Sahel did great damage in terms of adding to a lot of this destabilization. And that history for me is important to note. And what we're seeing in Niger and other places is also part of that blowback as well. And I'm just very curious to know, perhaps, those of you in Washington, D.C. that follow this more closely, it was Biden that pulled out of Afghanistan after $2 trillion and 20 years and total wastage. And I think the last thing he would want going into a re-election battle is a kind of Black Hawk Down Somalia type situation. You know, you mentioned the 4 US troops that were killed in 2019, and many people were shocked at the beginning of the Trump administration, like what's the US military doing in Niger? So I'm wondering whether that will actually make the US a bit more cautious. And it's something that I think we need to also think a little bit about.
Yeah, well said. I mean, and it's really interesting to sort of follow what signals are coming, often from anonymous U.S. officials quoted in the press about their willingness to engage the junta, right? There seems to be at least one strand of thinking within the U.S. government that would preserve, security assistance and make exceptions for Niger, despite provisions in U.S. regulations that would cut off assistance to coup makers. Some seem to be arguing that Niger is just too important to kind of walk away from. On the other hand, that would send, I think, a really powerful and, to my mind, hypocritical message about stated U.S. values on democracy. So yeah, there's.
But we know that the U.S. did that in Egypt.
Yeah, no, there's a precedent. No, of course, yeah, it's true. No, they'll make exceptions for situations they see as critical to U.S. interests, as which are always subjective, of course. There's so many brilliant questions in the chat, and we're starting to get toward the end of the session. There's one here I'll direct to Stephanie because this was something I had meant to ask you anyways. And this is very well phrased from Andrew Bouton. What role, if any, does U.S. military training play in these coups? As far as I know, these FMT courses and other foreign military training courses, especially for the officer corps, focus on teaching respect for civilian rule, human rights, and democracy. Yet each time we see a coup, the junta invariably contains officers who have gone through multiple U.S. training courses. Is this just a coincidence, or is there a causal connection? Stephanie, I'll add to that you see sort of, I think, the full range of opinions now in the debate. You see some people saying, these should be understood as sort of U.S. trained officers, and almost sort of implying that like the U.S. has an intense relationship. On the other hand, you see people sometimes dismissing it entirely, right, and saying, this is just any sort of colonel or general in the Sahel would have participated in some kind of U.S. training exercise, so this means very little. And then you see, and I guess this is more where I am, sort of a range, right? And saying, okay, let's look at the specifics of how a particular officer, engaged with the United States, what the extent of the contact was before we kind of assess what this means. And you had talked about Moussa Barmou earlier, who's become, now sort of infamous in the wake of the coup. In any case, how do you look at the impact of U.S. training and the relationship to coups, if any?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a lot of truth to the perspective that the US government has trained people to such a broad scale that, of course, there's going to be quite a number of the coup leaders who have been trained by the US, because the US has trained so many of these military leaders. And I think, there is a structural argument to be made in the sense that the US has just really heavily funded these militaries. And there was a recent UNDP study that showed that countries with a history of military involvement in politics and a very continuing active role of the military in government are more likely to see these ongoing coups. So I think the structural argument is that the military, the U.S. has kind of contributed to this imbalance that we see in some of these countries, and the military kind of continuing, really local. I mean, these are local traditions, and this is the fifth coup in Niger since independence. So you can't overstate this either. I mean, that's important to recognize. But then the hundreds of millions of dollars, what does that do to this already skewed balance of power, where the military has this overactive role in determining political outcomes?
Great, excellent. There's one question I can handle really quickly, which is from Mark Brzezinski, who says, how many people are attending this webinar? So currently, I think we peaked at 199 a few seconds ago. So, and as Mark is saying, this is important to know, to have some idea how much or how little interest there is about Niger at this point. I'm actually surprised. I'm glad that we got into triple digits. I actually didn't expect that.
You were at 215, Alex, at one point.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. So I missed that. Okay, so we peaked over 200, which I think, as Mark was saying, I think this is interesting about the level of interest. I don't think, well, who knows? I'm not sure one would have gotten, that level of interest for the coup in Guinea, for example, or even for Burkina Faso. I think Niger has gotten a higher level of attention, maybe because it's so late in the sequence, but also I think because Niger is seen as having more geopolitical significance than some of the others. I think we have time for a couple more. And if I don't get to your question, folks, I apologize, because there's really a lot of brilliant questions here in the chat. One, I'll direct this to Hannah from Peter Larson. Can someone examine the nature of quote unquote democratic rule in Niger, where poverty, literacy, et cetera, are huge challenges? Is this a matter of squinting to see what you want to see? I'll tack onto that, and could we say how democratic really were Mohamed Bazoum and his predecessor, Mahamadou Issoufou?
I think there's this this kind of myth of the model, and Stephanie touched on this earlier. But this sort of the model democracy is almost like it's like the kiss of death. I remember Mali in 2011 was referred to as a model of democracy, and shortly after it imploded spectacularly, and everything that was seen as sort of solid institutionally just crumbled. So to what extent was Niger on sort of a solid democratic path? A lot of it was wrapped up in President Bazoum and the political party and the sort of continuity that he brought to the table, coming after Issoufou, and the fact that he, comes from a minority group within the country. He was a leader who really represented something that I find really kind of particular to Niger. There's a lot more sort of mixing and inclusivity in Niger compared to sort of Burkina Faso and Mali. At least I think that's how sort of Nigerians see themselves that way, as sort of less separated by community differences. And so Bazoum was really skilled at sort of politics of inclusivity and working with a lot of different groups. And there was something democratic in that approach. In terms of institutional democracy, there were a lot of failures in terms of how the political institutions performed, including the elections, which were not transparent and had irregularities, including the banning of the main opposition candidate, in terms of his purge of the army, which was a direct contributing factor to this present day coup. In terms of his sort of crackdown on civil society, he was civil society critics and dissidents, people who called for corruption, journalists who spoke out against corruption and abuses were harassed and arrested. So there's this sense in which you can sort of perform democracy. Bazoum, to his credit, I think did bring more than just the kind of performance to the table, and did have a sort of an inclusive approach and a level of diplomacy and skill, which really should be sort of commended, and have been rare in the region. But at the same time, does it qualify as were the institutions supporting democracy, or was this more about one person? And then, to sort of go against what I've just said, the very fact that Bazoum sort of followed on the heels of Issoufou was already sort of evidence of state capture by a particular political faction. And arguably this coup is really just about the mode of alternance that the country has come to expect.
Yeah, and this is really important. I mean, part of this, right, is sort of like an abstract theoretical, question for political scientists, right, to think about, democracy and how to categorize super complex figures like Bazoum. But then a lot of it really matters, right, especially for sort of what's come up repeatedly in this session, which is kind of the perception of ordinary citizens, right, of how, what these figures represent, and a figure who is seen as a democrat and a skillful diplomat and architect of stability could, in Washington or wherever, could be seen very, very differently in Niamey or in other parts of the country. We're almost out of time. A couple of interesting comments in the chat. So Jim Loeb, who's at Quincy Institute as well, flagging an op-ed by Alex de Waal in the New York Times, in which de Waal argued that it was time to face the fact that the Sahelian governments in particular simply lack the resources to tackle all the challenges they face, from jihadi insurrections to climate change to a lack of jobs and economic resources. This is really potentially quite bleak, and I would recommend reading the op-ed by de Waal as well. But I think that there's a serious call to think about the limitations of some of the these states and the poorest states in the world, some of them, and what they can achieve under heavy constraints, no matter who's in charge. Nathaniel Powell, another colleague, Sahel expert, says France certainly has economic interest in Niger, but its interest in Nigerian uranium has declined tremendously in the past 15 years or so. The legacies are certainly poisonous, but current French interests in Niger are about jihadists, about migration, about prestige, and about fears of humiliation and regional geostrategic concerns. In any case, and this was a key theme in the chat, was people thinking about the current role of France, thinking about issues of colonialism and neocolonialism and so forth. We're really almost out of time, so I think maybe we could just do any closing thoughts from the panelists. Adekeye, why don't we start with you? Any takeaways or anything you want to leave the audience with?
Well, I think we need to think a bit more deeply, as you have said and others have said, Alex, about what the root causes of these issues are. Mm-hmm. We need to think very carefully about governance issues also within West Africa, because those are the root causes of many of these problems. We know that the soldiers are opportunistic because we've had 30 years of military governments which have failed as spectacularly as politicians to transform these situations. But I think we also need to focus on the fact that when civilian governments, even if they're democratically elected, close off the political space and start acting autocratically, sometimes the military is the only mechanism to actually change these systems. So these are some of the things we need to think about. And then in terms of the lack of capacity of regional peacekeepers also, the UN is withdrawing from Mali, the AU, as I said, is withdrawing from Somalia. To think of a division of labor that's going to make sense, because in some of these cases, peacekeeping will still help stabilize situations while political solutions are being sought. Thanks.
Great. Stephanie, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think in all this kind of tangled web of complexities, the thing that I always try to ground myself in and come back to is the fact that this is something, all this conflict, it affects civilians, like regular people the most. Over 4.4 million Nigerians are food insecure. Hundreds of thousands are displaced. In neighboring Burkina Faso, they're calling it the least paid attention to humanitarian disaster in the world right now. So this is really dramatically affecting people. This has long-lasting impacts far beyond any violence. This is going to affect children and their ability to survive and thrive. It's going to, it just is so deep in terms of its effects on ordinary people, and the fear and the trauma and all of it that this kind of conflict perpetuates. So, I think in terms of thinking about a forward-looking solution, that's the topmost thing to keep in mind. And whatever the U.S. does, or other, any other foreign power for that matter, that's the main orienting pole is, how do we kind of alleviate the suffering that this entails?
Yeah, I strongly agree. Obviously, I mean, I think amid looking at sort of the power politics in Niamey among the elite and looking at the geopolitics, I think it's easy sometimes to lose sight of ordinary people, but that's where I think the focus should be as well. Hannah, last word from you.
Yeah, well, to close on a bizarrely sort of optimistic note, I think that we actually, I mean, we're in an unusual moment right now where the U.S. for the first time is starting to diverge from French-led Western policy in the Sahel region. And I think, there's all of the anti-French sentiment that we've discussed and all of its consequences really don't apply to the United States, And I think that there is an opportunity, having said that, the U.S. isn't really taking seriously, its responsibilities in Africa. The fact that there hadn't been an ambassador to Niger at a time when these types of wars were going on, and we had this incredibly expensive drone base, or the fact that the post of Sahel envoy has been empty for a couple of years now, shows that it's clearly not a policy priority for the U.S. But I think that it's important. Up until now, Washington has been mostly content to sort of let Paris take the lead on Sahel issues. This hasn't really worked out well for anybody. And as we see Sahelians increasingly sort of turn against the French, there is an opportunity for the United States to chart its own path and try to find more positive ways to sort of support its partners. That's a very steep challenge, but it is an opening.
So a glimmer of hope amid a very bleak situation. We're over time, so thanks very much to Quincy for hosting. Thanks very much to the panelists for joining us and for sharing all their expertise. Thanks very much to the audience, and especially to all those who contributed questions and comments. Apologies to those of you whose questions we didn't get to. All of our panelists you can find online and read their work and continue to benefit from their expertise. So with that, I think we could close. So thanks again to everybody.